Your spousal sponsorship application was refused. Maybe you didn't get a refusal, but yours was returned. Now you're in a state of confusion because, as far as you know, you submitted a strong and completed spousal sponsorship application. What happened? I am Maquita Hibbert, bringing you your immigration tip. And today we're going to talk about how to prevent your spousal sponsorship application from being returned or being refused. Welcome back to my channel. Thanks for stopping by. In my last video, I spoke about what makes a strong spousal sponsorship application. Today, I want to share what makes a weak application. Because as much as you may think that you're putting together a strong application, there may be factors that you are missing that will weaken your application that can ultimately lead to a refusal or an incomplete application that will be returned. An incomplete application wastes time, in some instances, wastes money, and creates a longer time of being separated from your spouse. And no one wants that. A refused application, even worse. I have seen so many individuals who have come to me with a refused application, devastated. They were so hopeful. They had future plans. They changed things around because they were certain that their spouse was coming and they were going to be together. But something happened. And those are the things that I want to talk with you about, that when you prepare your application, you will not make those same mistakes, that your application will then be refused or returned. Number one, not completing the application forms properly. So you read through the barrage of application forms that are necessary for the application. You may read a question, you were not so sure what the question was asking for, and you put the incorrect information. You may also miss questions, so some questions are left unanswered. There are sections in a form, especially when you complete the background declaration, that has multiple questions that you have to answer yes or no to. Sometimes you may miss a question and that question is not answered, or gaps in your timeline. So you have to report your education, your work history, your address history in chronological order, from one to the next. Even if there was a 2-month gap, you cannot leave that as missing. You need to put something there, whether it was that you were in school, you were unemployed, or whatever was happening. But an explanation needs to be given so that there are no gaps in the timeline. Signatures. Missing signatures or something else that can lead to an application being returned as incomplete. Then there's also missing documents, police clearances, or expired documents. The PR photos wasn't done properly. The back section is missing, or information is missing from the back section of the application. As long as all the relevant and required information is not present, your application will be considered as incomplete, and that will lead to your application being returned. Number two, going back again to the documentation. There are essential documents that you must submit with the application that will show forth the genuineness of your relationship. If it is that all the important documents are not included, then that could lead to an incorrect assessment of your application, and your application could be refused. That's the last thing that you want to happen, because when your application is refused, you're starting all over again. Now you're going to have to figure out what is needed. And the sad thing is, when IRCC sometimes returns an application, refuse an application, they're not always so explicit in terms of what is missing, especially when they consider an application incomplete. They may say your application is incomplete because of missing information, You're looking, they may even point out the form. You're looking through the form over and over and over, and you cannot understand what the issue is because as far as you can see, everything is there that needs to be there. Going back to the missing documents. So you prepare your application, and for example, you do not submit proof of your communication and you are not living together in the same country. That will be a big red flag. How are you communicating with each other? So that missing bit of information can be detrimental to your application. Missing information about your relationship and how it developed. If you do not put all the details for that, that will show forth that in a manner that is acceptable to IRCC, that could affect your application and could lead to a refusal of the application. Not showing all the ties that you have together. Another factor that can also affect an application. These things may seem so simple and so straightforward, but you would be surprised at how many people get their applications refused for these simple things. And then when you look at the application and you ask, do you have this or do you have that? They'll say yes. And then you say, so why didn't you submit it with the application? Because I didn't think it was important. So that's another factor that can lead to your application being refused. Another thing that can lead to an application not making it through to the system is incorrect fees. So there are fees that must be paid with your application. There is the processing fee, and there is the landing fee. Biometrics also now is required for all PR applications, whether you have a valid biometrics or not. And I am mentioning biometrics because some people think that they have already done biometrics, and because they've done one and it's very valid, they don't need to do one. The rule is that you will have to do a new biometrics. So even though biometrics may not necessarily lead to your application being returned as incomplete, it can really slow down the application because now they're going to have to write you to say, we need the money for the biometrics, and you're going to have to pay that. You have to submit that, and you have to write back again for you to get the biometrics done. If all the fees are paid up front at the start, then it eliminates any back and forth, and it eliminates any consideration that the fees are not correct. With the application fees, if you submit your application with incorrect processing fees, your application will be returned as incomplete because it is necessary that you submit the correct processing fees for the application. The landing fee, that is something that you could pay later on at the time of landing, but paying it up front removes any delay that may be caused for them to be writing you to say that you need to be sending them the landing fees. So paying all your fees up front and paying the correct fees will help your application and will not lead to any negative outcomes where your application is concerned. Another reason why your application could be refused is using the incorrect version of the application forms. Luckily, IRCC has moved the spousal sponsorship application to online. So a lot of the forms are actually completed in the online portal. So you don't have to download a form, complete it as it was in the past when applications were paper-based. But there are still some forms that must be downloaded, completed, and uploaded into the system. IRCC forms, they all have version dates. So if you look at your form, your PDF form, at the left corner at the bottom, you will see the form number, IMM, something else, some numbers, and you'll see a date. So that date will tell you what the version of the form is. If a newer version of the form comes out, that date will change to the newer date. Sometimes you may start your application and you put it on pause. You download the forms, you fill them out on your computer, you put your application on pause, several months have gone by, and then you're ready to get going again and you just upload the forms that you already completed. But during that time of waiting, the forms may have changed. So it's always important that you check the form before you upload it to ensure that you're using the latest version. And I would say, even if you upload it and you still take some time to submit the application, that you check again to make sure that that form version is still current and the version hasn't changed, because that submitting the older version of the form when there's a newer one could also lead to the application being considered incomplete. So I want to go back to the signatures for a second. Not signing your forms properly can also lead to your application being returned. So for example, you're sponsoring a spouse or you're sponsoring children. When you're sponsoring children who are part of the application, depending on their age, they will be required to sign their own forms. So if the parent signs the form and the child doesn't, then now you have an error with the application. And then there are the cases where you have non-accompanying parents for children, and that there are documents that they also need to sign. So if the incorrect person signs those documents, then those documents will not be considered as completed. And that could be a reason for an incomplete application, so that an application would be returned to you. Another reason that we see why applications are returned as incomplete: not understanding who is a sponsor from who is the applicant. So when you're completing the forms, there is a section of the form that requires information for the sponsor, and then there are forms that are just for the applicant. What we've seen sometimes is that the sponsor may fill out the applicant section, vice versa, or the sponsor fills out more section than they actually need to. The sponsor is the Canadian, whether it's a Canadian citizen or the Canadian permanent resident that is trying to bring their spouse to be a resident of Canada with them. The applicant is that person who is trying to move to Canada. So you have to be aware of who is the applicant, who is the sponsor, so that you will put the right information in the right section of the form. And then that also goes back to the signatures. When you're signing the forms, there are forms that are required for the applicant to sign, and there are forms that are required for the sponsor to sign. So you have to ensure that each individual will sign in the correct space on their respective forms. The photo is one thing that I want to revisit. PR photos that are required for your application must be done by certain specifications. I have seen applications returned because there was something wrong with the photo. So the photo was either too small, which is usually the case, not necessarily too big, but too small. So the photographer didn't follow the photo specifications that are given by IRCC. They do have permanent residence photo specifications, and I would recommend that if your photographer is not familiar with Canada PR photos, that you bring that they can see the dimensions, they can see what the photo should look like, from chin to the top of your head, the spacing, they have all of that, the lighting, and then don't forget to put the relevant information at the back section of the photo, and that must be uploaded, also including the applicant's name and their date of birth. So my last tip to avoid your application being considered as incomplete is to check the country-specific information. So depending on the country where the individual is from, IRCC may have specific requirements or additional requirements that the individual must meet for the application. So it could be additional documents or anything like that the applicant must present. Also note that if the applicant is from a non-English speaking country, their documents have to be translated if they're not in English, and the translated copies are what? So all information that is submitted to IRCC must be in English. So the documents need to be translated. So at the end of the day, do all that you can do to avoid mistakes that will cause your application to be refused or to be returned, so that you can save yourself a lot of stress. So if you want to check out my other video on what makes a strong spousal sponsorship application, then you'll see the corresponding site to this video. So now you know what weakens your application, and that video will tell you about what strengthens your application. Combine the two together, and then you should be able to have a complete application that will most likely receive an approval. Thank you for stopping by. Please, if you haven't yet, hit subscribe to our channel so that you can get more content, and like our video. Take care.